She smiled and stepped aside. They mocked her, quoted rules and tradition. But someone opened her file, and pages of classified missions spilled out. She hadn't just seen combat. She led it. And now, even silence couldn't deny her place. The conference room at Fort Carson buzzed with the familiar energy of military professionals gathering for another policy discussion that would inevitably circle back to the same tired arguments about gender integration and combat effectiveness. Around the polished table sat colonels and sergeant majors, staff officers, and senior NCOs, all preparing to debate whether women belonged in direct combat roles with the same passion they brought to discussions about equipment procurement and training schedules. Captain Sarah Chen sat quietly at the far end of the table, her notebook open, her pen ready, her expression carefully neutral as she listened to conversations that had been happening in various forms since she first put on a uniform 15 years earlier. She had learned long ago that these discussions rarely benefited from her participation, that her presence was often seen as politically motivated rather than professionally necessary, that her opinions were frequently dismissed before they were fully expressed. The men around the table spoke with the confidence of people whose perspectives had never been seriously challenged, whose assumptions about combat effectiveness were based on tradition rather than evidence, whose understanding of warfare came from experiences that had never included working alongside women in life-or-death situations. Their arguments were familiar, predictable, and completely disconnected from the realities that Sarah had lived through during 5 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. But today was different. Today, someone had made a mistake that would change everything. Someone had brought Sarah's personnel file to the meeting, intending to use her record as an example of successful women's integration into support roles. Someone had assumed that her quiet demeanor and administrative assignment meant that her combat experience was limited to convoy security and base operations. Someone was about to learn that assumptions about women in combat often said more about the people making them than about the women serving. Welcome to Silent Salute. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Colonel Marcus Webb had requested this meeting to address ongoing concerns about the integration of women into combat units. Concerns that had been raised by some of his senior NCOs who questioned whether recent policy changes were based on political correctness rather than military effectiveness. As a brigade commander with 3 decades of experience, Webb felt responsible for ensuring that his units maintained the highest standards of combat readiness regardless of political pressures from above. The discussion had followed its usual pattern, with various speakers citing historical precedents, physiological differences, unit cohesion concerns, and cultural factors that supposedly made gender integration problematic for direct combat operations. The arguments were presented with the authority of professional military experience, supported by selective statistics and reinforced by anecdotal evidence from officers who had never actually served alongside women in combat situations. Captain Chen's presence at the meeting was intended to provide perspective from someone who had successfully integrated into a traditionally male military environment, demonstrating that women could contribute effectively to military operations without disrupting unit effectiveness or compromising combat readiness. Her assignment to brigade staff had been highlighted as an example of successful career progression for female officers. But Colonel Webb had made a fundamental error in his preparation for the meeting. He had requested Chen's personnel file to provide context for the discussion, assuming that her record would show the typical progression of a female officer through support roles and administrative assignments that had gradually expanded to include limited combat exposure through convoy operations and base security duties. What Webb didn't know, what none of the men in the room understood, was that Sarah Chen's military record told a completely different story. Her quiet demeanor and current staff assignment masked a combat history that exceeded the experience of most of the officers sitting around the table, a record of leadership under fire that challenged every assumption they had made about women's capabilities in warfare. The file that Webb opened to illustrate his points about gradual integration and appropriate roles for female personnel contained information that would transform the entire discussion from theoretical debate to personal confrontation with documented evidence of women's combat effectiveness. Page after page of classified mission reports, Unit citations and personal commendations told a story that contradicted every argument being made against women in combat. As Webb began reading from what he assumed would be a routine personnel record, his voice gradually slowed, then stopped entirely. The room fell silent as the colonel's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something approaching disbelief. The file in his hands contained not the expected progression through support roles, but 5 years of continuous combat operations in some of the most dangerous areas of Iraq and Afghanistan. The missions detailed in Chen's record weren't convoy security or base operations. They were direct action raids against high-value targets, close-quarters combat in urban environments, special operations that had been classified at levels that most of the officers in the room had never accessed. Each operation had been led by Captain Chen, planned by her team, executed under her command with results that had contributed significantly to overall mission success. The silence in the room deepened as Webb continued reading, discovering that the quiet captain at the end of the table had been awarded 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and multiple unit citations for valor under fire. Her combat experience included operations that had never been acknowledged publicly, missions that remained classified years after their completion, achievements that placed her among the most decorated officers of her generation. Combat effectiveness statistics from Chen's deployments painted a picture that demolished every argument that had been made about women's impact on unit performance. The teams she had led showed higher mission success rates, lower casualty figures, and better overall performance metrics than comparable all-male units operating in similar environments. Her leadership had not compromised combat effectiveness, it had enhanced it. The documentation included testimonials from male soldiers who had served under Chen's command, statements that praised her tactical judgment, her courage under fire, and her ability to maintain unit cohesion during the most demanding combat operations. These weren't politically correct endorsements, but authentic assessments from soldiers whose lives had depended on her leadership capabilities. Special operations commanders had specifically requested Chen for missions that required the highest levels of tactical expertise and leadership under pressure. Her reputation within the special operations community had led to assignments that were normally reserved for the most experienced male officers, roles that she had filled with distinction while maintaining the operational security that kept her achievements hidden from broader military knowledge. The medal citations in Chen's file described actions that went far beyond the call of duty, moments when her quick thinking and courageous action had saved American lives and accomplished mission objectives that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Each citation represented a situation where gender had been irrelevant compared to professional competence and personal courage. Intelligence reports documented Chen's effectiveness in cultural environments where her presence had been crucial to mission success, situations where her ability to interact with local populations had provided intelligence and cooperation that male-only teams couldn't achieve. Her gender had been an operational advantage rather than a limitation in contexts that required cultural sensitivity and community engagement. Training evaluations showed that Chen had consistently outperformed her male peers in every measure of combat readiness, from marksmanship to tactical planning to leadership under stress. Her scores placed her in the top percentile of officers regardless of gender, demonstrating excellence that transcended any category except individual capability and professional dedication. The progression of her career through increasingly demanding assignments painted a picture of an officer whose potential had been recognized and developed by commanders who valued results over preconceptions. Each promotion had been based on demonstrated performance rather than diversity initiatives, earned through achievements that spoke for themselves in environments where failure meant death. As Webb finished reading selected portions of the file, the room remained silent, each officer processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about women's role in combat operations. The evidence was undeniable, documented in official records that couldn't be dismissed as opinion or political interpretation. Chen's record represented proof that women could not only participate effectively in combat, but could excel as leaders in the most demanding military environments. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Officers who had been confidently arguing against women in combat found themselves confronting evidence that their assumptions were based on prejudice rather than fact. The presence of Captain Chen, who had remained silent throughout the discussion, suddenly carried weight that extended far beyond her current rank or assignment. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who had been among the most vocal opponents of gender integration, found himself staring at Chen with new understanding. His arguments about unit cohesion and combat effectiveness seemed hollow when confronted with documented evidence of superior performance under conditions that had tested every aspect of military leadership. The younger officers in the room began to recognize that they were in the presence of someone whose combat experience exceeded their own, whose achievements represented the kind of military excellence they aspired to achieve. Chen's quiet professionalism took on new meaning when understood as the bearing of someone who had proven herself in situations that most of them had never faced. Colonel Webb realized that his meeting had been transformed from policy discussion to education session, that the officer he had invited to provide perspective had instead provided definitive evidence that challenged the premises underlying the entire debate. The file in his hands represented not just one woman's achievements, but proof that military effectiveness was determined by individual capability rather than gender stereotypes. The questions that followed were different from the theoretical arguments that had dominated the earlier discussion. Officers began asking about specific operations, tactical decisions, leadership challenges that Chen had faced and overcome. The conversation shifted from whether women belonged in combat to how the military could better identify and develop the kind of excellence that Chen's record demonstrated. Chen's responses were measured and professional, focusing on tactical and leadership principles rather than gender issues. She described her combat experiences in terms that emphasized team performance, mission accomplishment, and the factors that contributed to success in demanding operational environments. Her perspective was that of a professional soldier rather than a representative of any cause or movement. The impact on unit performance that Chen described contradicted every negative assumption that had been expressed about women in combat. Her teams had shown improved communication, better attention to detail, enhanced problem-solving capabilities, and stronger overall cohesion than many all-male units. Gender integration had been a force multiplier rather than a limitation. Cultural insights that Chen had gained through her deployments provided additional evidence of women's value in complex operational environments. Her ability to gather intelligence, build relationships with local populations, and navigate cultural sensitivities had contributed to mission success in ways that couldn't be replicated by male-only teams. The training implications of Chen's experience suggested that military education needed to focus more on individual capabilities and less on gender-based assumptions. Her success had been built on the same foundation of professional competence, physical fitness, and mental toughness that defined excellent soldiers regardless of gender. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had been completely transformed. What had begun as a discussion about whether women belonged in combat had become recognition that combat effectiveness was determined by individual excellence rather than demographic categories. Chen's record provided undeniable evidence that the right women could not only participate in combat, but could excel as leaders in the most demanding military environments. The officers who left that room carried with them a new understanding of what gender integration could achieve when it was based on merit rather than quotas, when individual capability was valued over preconceptions, when excellence was recognized regardless of its source. Chen's quiet presence had provided more powerful advocacy for women in combat than any political argument could achieve. Colonel Webb's report on the meeting reflected a fundamental shift in his understanding of gender integration issues. The documentation of Chen's achievements provided evidence that policy changes were not based on political correctness, but on recognition of demonstrated capability. The military's responsibility was to utilize talent wherever it was found, regardless of traditional assumptions about who could serve effectively in combat roles. The story of Captain Chen's revelation spread throughout the military community, carried by officers who had witnessed the transformation of their own understanding about women's capabilities in combat. The narrative became part of institutional learning about the importance of evaluating individuals based on merit rather than assumptions. For Chen herself, the meeting represented a rare moment when her achievements received appropriate recognition from colleagues who had previously dismissed women's potential in combat roles. The visibility of her record created opportunities for mentoring younger female officers who could benefit from understanding what was possible with dedication and excellence. The broader implications of Chen's story extended beyond gender integration to fundamental questions about how the military identified, developed, and utilized talent. Her success demonstrated that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that preconceptions could blind organizations to their most capable personnel, that true military effectiveness required openness to all forms of demonstrated competence. Policy discussions at Fort Carson and throughout the military establishment began incorporating Chen's record as evidence that gender integration policies were based on documented capability rather than political considerations. Her achievements provided concrete proof that women could not only participate effectively in combat operations, but could excel as leaders in the most demanding military environments. The training implications of Chen's experience led to revised curricula that emphasized individual assessment over demographic assumptions. Military education programs began focusing more intensively on identifying and developing talent regardless of its source, understanding that combat effectiveness depended on individual capability rather than traditional expectations about who could serve in various roles. Chen's combat leadership techniques became subjects of study in military academies and staff colleges, where her tactical innovations and team management strategies were analyzed for broader application. Her methods demonstrated that effective military leadership transcended gender boundaries, that excellence in combat command could be achieved through various approaches that reflected individual strengths rather than conventional models. The special operations community, which had directly benefited from Chen's leadership during her classified missions, began advocating more strongly for expanded opportunities for women in combat roles. Their support was based on operational experience rather than political ideology, understanding that Chen's contributions had enhanced mission effectiveness in ways that couldn't be replicated by excluding capable personnel based on gender. Intelligence agencies incorporated Chen's cultural insights and operational approaches into training programs for personnel deploying to complex environments where gender dynamics affected mission success. Her experience demonstrated that women's participation in combat operations could provide tactical advantages that enhanced overall military effectiveness rather than compromising it. Congressional testimony about military readiness began including references to Chen's record as evidence that personnel policies should be based on individual merit rather than categorical exclusions. Her documented achievements provided lawmakers with concrete examples of how inclusive policies could enhance rather than diminish military capability. International military exchanges included discussions of Chen's experience as an example of how Allied forces could benefit from utilizing all available talent in combat operations. Her success challenged traditional assumptions about women's roles in warfare that existed in military cultures worldwide, providing evidence that effectiveness transcended conventional gender boundaries. Chen's mentorship of younger female officers became a formal program that helped other women navigate military careers while maintaining the high standards that she had demonstrated throughout her own service. Her guidance emphasized competence over politics, individual excellence over group identity, professional achievement over symbolic representation. The documentation process for combat operations was improved based on lessons learned from Chen's experience, ensuring that future achievements by women in combat would be properly recorded and recognized rather than being lost in bureaucratic oversight. Her case demonstrated the importance of maintaining accurate records that reflected actual contributions rather than assumptions about capabilities. Military medical research incorporated data from Chen's deployments to better understand how women's physiology affected combat performance, providing evidence-based information for policy decisions rather than relying on theoretical assumptions. The research demonstrated that individual variation was more significant than gender differences in determining combat effectiveness. Equipment and uniform modifications were developed based on feedback from Chen and other women who had served in combat roles, ensuring that military gear was optimized for all personnel rather than being designed only for male body types. These improvements enhanced combat effectiveness for all service members while addressing specific needs of women in combat. Chen's leadership philosophy was incorporated into officer development programs that emphasized adaptive leadership styles rather than one-size-fits-all approaches to military command. Her success demonstrated that effective leadership could take many forms, that diversity in leadership approaches enhanced unit performance rather than compromising it. The legal framework governing women's participation in combat was strengthened by documentation of Chen's achievements, providing concrete evidence for policy decisions that had previously been based on theoretical considerations rather than operational experience. Her record became a foundation for expanded opportunities for women throughout the military. International conferences on military effectiveness began featuring presentations about Chen's experience as an example of how armed forces could enhance their capabilities by fully utilizing available human resources. Her story became part of global discussions about modernizing military institutions to meet contemporary security challenges. Chen's tactical innovations were incorporated into field manuals and training publications that emphasized adaptive problem-solving over rigid adherence to traditional approaches. Her methods demonstrated that combat effectiveness could be enhanced through diverse perspectives and innovative thinking rather than conventional approaches alone. The evaluation criteria for combat leadership positions were revised to focus more intensively on demonstrated capability rather than assumptions about who could succeed in various roles. Chen's record provided evidence that individual assessment was more reliable than categorical assumptions in predicting combat effectiveness. Military families' perspectives on women in combat began shifting as stories like Chen's demonstrated that female service members could excel in the most demanding military roles while maintaining the professionalism and dedication that families expected from military personnel. Her example helped bridge the gap between traditional expectations and contemporary realities. Chen's continued service in staff roles was enhanced by recognition that her combat experience provided unique insights into operational planning and strategic development. Her perspective was valued not because she was a woman, but because she was a proven combat leader whose experience enhanced institutional decision-making capabilities. The recruiting process for combat positions was modified to ensure that qualified women received appropriate opportunities to compete for roles that had previously been closed to them. Chen's success demonstrated that merit-based selection would identify capable personnel regardless of gender if the process was designed to assess actual capability rather than demographic characteristics. Training facilities were updated to accommodate the reality that women would be participating in all aspects of military preparation, ensuring that facilities and programs supported excellence regardless of the gender composition of training units. These improvements enhanced the quality of training for all personnel while addressing specific needs of integrated units. Chen's story became part of military history curricula that helped future officers understand how military institutions had evolved to become more effective through inclusive policies based on merit rather than tradition. Her achievements represented progress in military effectiveness rather than social experimentation. The career progression patterns for women in combat roles were analyzed using Chen's experience as a model for how individual excellence could overcome institutional barriers through demonstrated competence rather than political advocacy. Her success provided a roadmap for other women seeking to excel in traditionally male military specialties. Chen's awards and decorations were displayed in military museums as examples of how women had contributed to American military success throughout history, providing visible recognition that challenged traditional narratives about women's roles in warfare. Her achievements became part of the documented record of American military excellence. Sometimes the most powerful arguments for change come not from advocacy, but from demonstrated excellence that speaks for itself. Sometimes institutional barriers fall not because of political pressure, but because individual achievement makes exclusion impossible to justify. Sometimes the people who change history are those who focus on excellence rather than politics, who let their performance speak louder than their arguments. Sarah Chen never set out to be a symbol or advocate for women in combat. She had simply pursued excellence in whatever assignment she received, understanding that competence was the most effective form of advocacy for expanded opportunities. When her record finally received appropriate recognition, it provided evidence that transformed institutional understanding and opened possibilities for future generations of military women. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever witnessed a moment when documented achievements completely transformed a discussion about what was possible? When evidence overcame assumptions and changed minds that seemed closed to new perspectives? Tell us in the comments about times when quiet excellence spoke louder than any argument. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.